After winning, my parents called me smart for the first time, though all my life I'd heard only reproach and contempt from them. To show them the price of such recognition, I bought their apartment and rented it out to strangers, depriving them of their familiar home and their power over me. My father desperately tried to recoup what he'd lost, but all his efforts only led to ruin and a complete loss of control. Hi, this is the Cold Vengeance community. We share the most captivating and intriguing stories that end in cold revenge. Subscribe and stay with us. When I think back to that day, I immediately remember the evening my parents first called me smart. It seemed like a common word, but I'd never heard it from them before, and it hit harder than any blow, because for 28 years, I'd only gotten used to reproaches, sarcasm, and ridicule from my parents. Our family lived in Chicago. My father worked as a mechanic in a small auto repair shop, and my mother sold clothes in a store. We were never rich, but we didn't consider ourselves poor either. However, an atmosphere of discontent always reigned in the house. I don't remember a single moment when my parents were proud of me. I tried hard to bring home good grades at school, but my father simply dismissed it, saying that grades were just papers, and that the most important thing in life was the ability to use your hands. My mother constantly compared me to her friend Laura's son, who seemed to always be the perfect example. With each passing year, I grew to feel that no matter what I achieved, my parents would always find a reason to pick on me. When I graduated from college and got a job at a small software company, my parents were indifferent. My father said my job was just sitting at a computer and clicking buttons, and that a real job should involve physical labor. My mother believed that programmers were a temporary phenomenon and that I had wasted my years of study. I got used to keeping quiet. I learned to live on my own, renting a room near the office and rarely coming home. Then something happened that changed everything. Our office held a lottery between the company's employees and partners. It was a kind of marketing ploy. The grand prize was $200,000. No one really believed they could win. I filled out the form myself, not really expecting much. 2 weeks later, the results were announced, and my name was on the list of winners. I couldn't believe it. They handed me a check, and I held it in my hands as if it were someone else's life. I came home to my parents in the evening. I thought I'd just tell them and leave. At that moment, I didn't even expect them to be genuinely happy. But when I showed the check, my mother suddenly threw up her hands and said, "Well done." My father repeated the same thing, adding that I had finally done something useful. I froze. These words were spoken with such ease, as if they said them every day, but for the first time I heard anything warm from them. I understood that their joy was not in me, but in the sum of money I held in my hands. At that moment, everything inside me sank, but outwardly I smiled and agreed with everything they said. My mother immediately began making plans for how to invest the money. My father started talking about renovating the apartment. They discussed it as if it were their money. I listened and remained silent. That night, I returned to my place and couldn't sleep for a long time. A week later, I made a decision. I bought their apartment. Not in the sense of taking the documents for myself and kicking them out. I drew up an official contract. We formalized the transaction so that the apartment was transferred to my name. My parents were happy. They believed that their son had finally proven himself a man and taken care of the family. I saw it differently. Resentment from all the years of humiliation was building up inside me. I decided to rent the apartment to strangers. I found a real estate agency and quickly signed a lease. The apartment with a good location was in demand. A young couple, Mark and Christina, moved in. I told my parents that the apartment was temporarily undergoing renovations and that it was impossible to live there. They didn't object. At first, I paid their rent in another building, but gradually, they began to feel uneasy. My father complained that he didn't like the neighborhood. My mother said she was having a hard time adjusting to new neighbors. I listened and pretended to look for options. Every month, I received rent from Mark and Christina. This money covered my expenses and gave me a sense of control. I knew I was being cruel, but I felt like this was the only way to show my parents that I could manage my own life. When they told me I was smart, I remembered all the times they considered me a nobody. At some point, my mother noticed that I started visiting them more often and taking an interest in their affairs. She asked why I had become so caring. I replied that I wanted to make up for lost time. In reality, I wanted to see how they would react to the changes. I saw that their lives had become more difficult. They had to get used to their new home. They often argued among themselves. My father became irritable, my mother nervous. I watched it as if I were watching a movie. One day, as we were sitting at dinner, my mother again called me a smart girl, saying I was the only one supporting the family. My insides twisted. I knew it was a lie, that her words were empty. Part of me hungrily hung on every phrase. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had finally gotten what I'd been waiting for. With each passing month, my relationship with my parents grew more strained. They began to suspect that the apartment wasn't being renovated. My father tried to ask me directly, but I evaded the question. My mother said she heard from a neighbor that other people were living in the apartment. I pretended to be surprised, but inside, I was preparing for the truth to come out. I knew perfectly well that sooner or later everything would be revealed, but it seemed important to me to see this through to the end. I wanted my parents to feel the same helplessness I'd felt around them my whole life. A few months after the apartment was transferred to my name, the tension in the family escalated into open warfare. My mother called more and more often, asking when they would be coming home and why the renovations were taking so long. My father began asking neighbors and acquaintances to help find out who was living in the apartment. One day, my mother told me that my father had contacted someone and was going to go all the way. I didn't react violently, but I felt the end of this quiet game of silence approaching. My father came to me with printed documents and a paper packet of registry extracts. He placed the papers on the table and stared at me silently, leaving me with no illusions about the seriousness of his intentions. My father's lawyer made an official request and received confirmation that the title deed was properly registered and that no restrictions or encumbrances were listed in the records. I admitted that the apartment was rented out and that the decision had been deliberate. My father's reaction was sharp, accusing me of being a traitor and selling the family's honor for money. My mother tried to stem the flow of accusations, crying into the phone as if expecting pity to restore the former relationship. I remained silent and felt a strange calm and tension, knowing that legally I was right, but morally the situation was precarious. My father hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit, attempting to challenge the transaction by arguing that he had been pressured and that his actions had been thoughtless. The lawyer warned me that the chances were slim since all the paperwork was legally executed, but my father was stubborn and saw this not so much as a legal opportunity as a way to fight back and save face. The court dismissed the claim, and the documents confirmed the legality of the transaction. This decision was a blow to my father and an excuse to increase the pressure in other ways. My father began calling relatives and telling the story, trying to look like the victim. Some aunts and uncles openly condemned me and began calling at night with reproaches. This put pressure not only on me, but also on my mother, who alternately yelled at my father and cried into the phone, begging for reconciliation. My father went further and began coming to my office, waiting by the exit, and causing scenes in front of my colleagues. He called me a thief and said his son had thrown his parents out. My colleagues stopped looking at me the same way, and I began receiving sidelong glances and hushed conversations in the hallways. My boss was forced to intervene and ask for an explanation. I told the truth about my purchase and that the transaction was voluntary. This didn't stop the rumor mill, and I felt my professional reputation begin to tremble under the weight of family conflict. Meanwhile, the apartment was bringing in money, and Mark and Christina were paying the rent regularly and causing no problems. The agency confirmed the property was in good order, asked for confidentiality, and refused to disclose the tenant's information. I bought time and control, but my father perceived the facts differently and decided to pursue a path of social isolation and psychological pressure. He visited neighbors and asked who lived there. Accusatory calls began arriving to the real estate agency and even to the police, asking them to verify the legality of the lease. The police found no violations, which angered my father even more. Then he began to resort to other methods. He began trying to bribe people to find out the tenants' schedules, and he also sought out contacts who could cause inconvenience. At some point, it got to the point where my father came to Mark and Christina's house and knocked on the door, asking if it was really theirs. Mark politely but sternly replied that it was the landlord's personal business and that he had no intention of interfering. My father left, but returned 3 days later with his cousin Richard. Richard was more successful than my father, owned a business, and often expressed dissatisfaction with my lifestyle. They arrived together and tried to use their authority. Richard spoke of family honor and how one shouldn't treat one's own parents like that. I listened and responded that the apartment was legally registered and that the rent allowed me to live and help out as best I could. Richard expressed disappointment and assumed the stance of someone who disliked interfering, but was forced to show firmness. After their visit, my father became more aggressive. He began spreading rumors among mutual acquaintances that I was exploiting family connections and that the deal had damaged the family's reputation. This had an effect, as some acquaintances and clients began to look askance, and several old friends distanced themselves. At the same time, my mother began to change her tactics and switched to more gentle persuasion. She called mornings and evenings, asking for a return to our previous relationship and saying that my father couldn't handle the stress. My mother cried and asked me to at least temporarily give up some money or part of the profits so they could rent a more comfortable apartment. I thought several times about settling the conflict with money, but I realized it felt like bribing my conscience, and each time I recalled years of reproaches and comparisons with other people's children. Pity and the desire to exert control warred within me. The conflict between my father and me became a topic of discussion in the family and at work, and it began to have consequences for everyone. One of my uncles came to the agency and tried to obtain information about the lease terms and conditions. The agent refused, citing confidentiality laws. My father then tried to obtain records of the transaction through old acquaintances at the registration office, but the documents were in order, and no one wanted to interfere with a legal transaction. With legal and social avenues closed, my father began to consider practical steps. He began approaching landlords of other buildings, trying to find accommodations for his mother and himself closer to the area where their apartment had been. It seemed like an attempt to compensate for the loss, but in reality, my father wanted to demonstrate that he could live better without his son's help. The realization that my father had developed his own strategy pushed me to become even more assertive. I began to respond more harshly to my mother's calls, cut back on visits, and limited financial support to a minimum. This led to even greater harshness in their actions and further spread of rumors about my callousness. At one point, my father tried to arrange a meeting with mutual friends and relatives to enlist support and demonstrate that the family was on his side. Several people came and openly accused me of selling out my roots for money. I insisted that my actions were legally legitimate and that I had the right to dispose of the property as I saw fit. This caused an even greater rift, and between visits, my mother cried and begged me to return everything to normal. I sometimes felt a sense of unreality about what was happening, and I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I recalled every humiliation and every jab and realized it wasn't just about money. At the end of the month, my father wasn't alone. He brought with him a man with the short name Richard, who was the voice of public criticism in the family and who presented me with his vision of honor and responsibility. The conversation with Richard was tense and definitively demonstrated that there would be no compromise, that the issue of housing for my parents was now not only a legal battle, but also a clash of generations and honor. I left the conversation with a feeling that I had made a choice that would change our lives forever, and that the next step belonged to my father. After my father exhausted all legal and social attempts to regain control of the apartment, I realized it was time to consolidate my advantage and take the next step. The threat that he could destabilize the situation again remained, and the only way to close the loopholes was to further strengthen my position. I contacted a real estate agency and through them found investment options for new properties. The money I'd earned from renting my parents' apartment and the rest of my winnings allowed me to consider buying a small house in the Chicago suburbs. I wasn't planning on living there myself. It was purely an investment. The deal went through relatively quickly, and soon I had a second rental property. At that moment, I felt like I was managing something real and valuable for the first time in my life, not just living up to someone else's expectations. My parents found out almost immediately. My father heard from friends that I'd acquired a new house and took it as a slap in the face. He came to me and said I was getting rich by depriving them of their home. His voice trembled with rage and frustration. I calmly replied that I'd done it all myself, and that it was the result of my hard work and my decision. These words sounded like mockery to him. He left, but I knew that inside, his resolve to fight was only growing stronger. My mother, however, began to speak more softly. She called and urged me to share at least part of the proceeds. She offered a compromise, saying we could reach an agreement and that it would restore the family. But I felt it was just another form of pressure, only in a different guise. I said I would only help minimally and only to the extent I deemed necessary. This put an end to her attempts. Inside, I felt both bitterness and satisfaction. Bitterness because I knew I was finally destroying my bridges, satisfaction because for the first time no one could dictate my actions. To further protect myself, I signed a long-term lease with my parents' apartment tenants. Mark and Christina agreed to extend the lease for another 3 years, which became an additional shield for me. I knew my father would try to influence them, but now, even if pressured, they were protected by the official terms. When my father learned of this, he was furious. He tried to meet with Mark and Christina, but they refused to talk and informed me of his visit. I thanked them for their loyalty and knew I had made the right move. Soon, my father appeared at my office again. He stood at the entrance, loudly telling everyone in sight that I had betrayed my parents. My colleagues began whispering again, but this time I was prepared. I called security and asked them not to let him onto the premises anymore. For me, this symbolized the final cutting off of my old levers of influence. My father realized that access to my life was now blocked for him, but this only made his anger worse. He began pressuring his mother, telling her to act more firmly. His mother, on the other hand, seemed increasingly broken. She began calling less frequently, her voice was tired, and sometimes she would simply remain silent on the phone, sighing. I heard her weariness, and part of me wanted to soften, but memories of the past again turned me cold. I understood that these weren't random sighs, but a hidden attempt to evoke guilt. I didn't let it work. At the same time, the new tenants in the second house turned out to be less reliable. They were late with payments, and I had to remind them several times about the deadlines. This put additional stress on me, but I viewed it as an experience. I knew that each new step in investing only made me stronger and more independent from my parents. One evening, my cousin called me and said that my parents were trying to call a family council to discuss my behavior together. I laughed and said that they could meet as often as they wanted, but it wouldn't change anything. It was important to me that they understand that I was not the kind of person who could be controlled. A couple of weeks later, my father tried to arrange a meeting with a real estate agent and persuaded him to break my contract. The agent refused and informed me of the pressure. This was the final confirmation that my father had completely lost his leverage and was now acting blindly. I strengthened the contracts and made additional investments in renovating the second house to increase its market appeal. I knew this would temporarily hit my finances, but in the long run, it would only strengthen my position. My parents were arguing with each other more and more often. My mother blamed my father for his aggressive actions, saying that his actions were only making things worse. My father accused my mother of weakness and said that it was because of her that I had become like this. Their marriage was crumbling, and I watched it from the sidelines, like a spectator at a performance. I didn't interfere. I understood that each of their conflicts only confirmed my power over the situation. Inside, I felt bitterness, but also a strange satisfaction. One night, my mother finally called and said that my father was going to go even further. She hinted that he might try to directly influence the tenants or even cause them trouble. I listened and said it was his choice, but warned him that if he did anything illegal, he would face the police. Fear was evident in her voice. She begged me to stop and find a compromise, but I said that compromise was only possible if they recognized my right to make decisions. After that, my mother fell silent and hung up. In the following days, I felt tense and waited for my father to take action. But none came. He disappeared from view for a while. Perhaps he realized there was nowhere else to go. Perhaps he was looking for a new way to exert pressure. For me, it didn't matter. I focused on what I had built: 2 rental apartments, a stable income, and independence from my family. This was my counterattack, and it cemented everything I wanted to prove. Now I was no longer just a son who could be criticized. Now I was the person who held my parents' fates in my hands and could decide what would happen next. One evening, Mark called me and said that a man who said he was my father had appeared outside the apartment where he and Christina were living and was asking too many questions. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation, but gradually he began raising his voice, saying they were occupying someone else's place and that completely different people should live in their place. Mark calmly replied that they had a legal contract, but my father wouldn't listen. He stood at the door for almost half an hour, shouting that his son was a thief and a fraud. Mark couldn't take it anymore and called the police. After that, my father left, but the tension between the tenant and me escalated. Christina called the next day and said she wasn't sure whether they should continue living in the apartment. She was upset that someone was intruding on their lives and calling them accomplices to a fraud. I listened to her and suggested we meet to discuss everything. We talked in a cafe. I explained that my father had lost control and was trying to psychologically pressure me. I offered a discount on 1 month's rent to compensate for the emotional damage. Mark agreed to stay, but I could see that the trust had wavered a bit. A week later, the same thing happened again, only this time my father came in the middle of the night and started knocking on the door. Mark called the police again, and this time they took him to the station, but they soon released him, as there were no serious violations. I realized this could go on forever and that the tenants might snap and move out, which would ruin my plans. So I decided to take a different approach. I contacted a lawyer and filed a restraining order against me. My father found out about this and was furious. He called and said I was a traitor, that his own son had decided to destroy him. I listened silently and didn't respond because every word he said only confirmed the correctness of my actions. The court upheld my claim, and my father was officially banned from the house. Mark and Christina breathed a sigh of relief, but the bad feeling remained. They began asking more often if I could guarantee them a peaceful life. I understood that a landlord's reputation was paramount, so I decided to prove myself as reliable as possible. I installed new locks, paid for CCTV cameras at the entrance, and offered them the option of trading in my second apartment if they wanted. When I said this, confidence flashed in their eyes, and they agreed to stay. Then my father took a different approach. He started calling the real estate agency that handled my second purchase and accused me of being a fraud. He filed complaints about me renting out the apartment without proper documentation, but each complaint was met with disbelief because I had everything officially documented. The agency informed me of his calls and offered to strengthen my legal defense. I agreed and hired a separate lawyer. Now my father's every action was being recorded and turned into evidence of his pressure. He didn't understand that his actions were only making things worse and destroying any remaining trust. My mother tried to intervene, visiting Mark and Christina with gifts, bringing food, and saying she didn't support her husband's methods, but the tenants sensed the falseness. They told me her visits were just as unpleasant as their father's yelling, only instead of aggression, they attempted pity and pressure. I asked her to stop, but she said she couldn't go against her husband. In fact, I saw that she was doing it deliberately to drive a wedge into my tenancy agreement. Fortunately, Mark and Christina were sensible enough to understand that this was part of the family drama. They continued to live in the apartment, but were already beginning to consider moving out in the future. I began looking for new tenants in case they decided to leave and renovated the apartment to increase its value. At that point, my cousin came to me again and said that my father was planning to involve acquaintances to exert direct pressure. He hinted that minor mischief, such as damaging property or threatening the tenants, might begin. I realized the situation was getting more serious and that my father had crossed the line. I contacted a lawyer again, and we prepared documents so that any incident would immediately involve the police. I also warned Mark and Christina. They thanked me for my candor and said they would be more careful. A few weeks passed, and the tension eased somewhat. My father seemed to be keeping a low profile, perhaps deterred by the fact that the law was now on my side, or perhaps he realized that every action he took only strengthened my position. Meanwhile, I focused on the second house and found new tenants, who turned out to be more disciplined than the first. Gradually, I began to earn a steady income from both properties and felt my position growing stronger. Meanwhile, my parents were arguing more and more. My mother called less frequently, and my father stopped communicating altogether. For me, this was confirmation that my retaliatory strike had succeeded. Now they couldn't return the apartment, influence my decision, or break the leases, and every step they took only strengthened me. Deep down, I knew the war wasn't over, but now the initiative was completely in my favor. Despite all the measures I'd taken, despite the injunction, the cameras, the lawyers, and the official contracts, my father still wasn't going to give in. His stubbornness had become predictable. I knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he considered his, and at some point, I began to expect a direct violation of the law. This happened that evening, when Mark called me and said that my father had shown up at the apartment again, and this time it was much more serious. He wasn't alone, but with a man he knew. They knocked loudly on the door, demanding to be let in. Mark and Christina refused, but my father wasn't going to leave. He threatened to call the police if they didn't open the door and claim they were illegally occupying the property. Mark kept his cool and called the police himself. When the police arrived, my father tried to insist that the apartment belonged to him and that I had illegally rented it out to strangers. But Mark had documents, a lease agreement, and even a copy of a court order restraining him from approaching my father. The police issued a violation. My father was arrested, and his friend was also charged with complicity. That night, I arrived at the house, saw him being driven away in a car, and for the first time in my life, I realized that I was truly in control. But at the same time, there was another feeling, not joy, but a strange heaviness. Everything happened as I expected, everything was logical and correct, but inside I felt empty, as if with this arrest I had finally lost what I once called family. The next day my mother called me. Her voice was tired and hoarse. She was crying and saying that I had driven my father to prison, that I had destroyed the family, and that now they had finally lost everything. I remained silent, because words seemed meaningless. How many years they had destroyed me, how many times had they devalued my efforts, how many times had my father told me I was nothing, and only after winning did he call me smart, as if everything I had done before was insignificant. I didn't feel guilty, but I felt cold. My mother asked me to withdraw the complaint and help my father avoid the consequences, but I knew that would be a step backwards and all my efforts would be in vain. I told her that the court had made its decision, and I did not intend to interfere. After these words, she hung up. For several days, I waited for more calls, waited for pressure from my relatives, but none came. Apparently, the news of my father's arrest and his violation of the law signaled to everyone that the fight was over. My brother wrote a short message that everything was now on me and the family was completely torn apart. I responded with just one word, "I know," and closed the conversation. At that time, I focused on the tenants. I met with them in person to reassure them that there would be no more threats. I showed them copies of the documents, told them that my father had broken the law and was now under investigation, and assured them that I would do everything to make them feel safe. Mark nodded, Christina said she felt calmer, and I realized that control was returning. The second house was also generating income. The new tenants were paying regularly, and I saw myself step by step building a system that was no longer dependent on the whims of my parents. But I couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness. In the evenings, I sat alone, staring at the numbers in the accounts, thinking about new projects, and caught myself realizing that I no longer needed all this for myself. Everything I did was just to prove it to them. I remembered the day I heard my parents call me smart girl, and I realized that it was the moment I decided to break everything. Not praise, not support, but cynical recognition, motivated solely by money. I had engineered my revenge. I had made them dependent on me. I had shown them I was stronger. But even now, with my father sitting in a cell and my mother crying, I felt no victory. I felt only emptiness and understood that true recognition from them would never come. A few weeks later, the court scheduled a hearing for my father's case. His lawyer tried to argue that he had acted under emotional pressure, that he posed no threat, but all the documents and testimony from the tenants were against him. The judge imposed a suspended sentence and an even stricter ban on me and the apartment. It wasn't prison, but for him, it symbolized his complete defeat. After the hearing, I left the courtroom, and my mother stood near the exit. She looked at me, her eyes red, but no words came. We simply locked eyes and went our separate ways. I never saw them again. My mother tried to call a few more times, but I didn't answer because I knew how it would end. She would cry, blame me for breaking up the family, beg me to help my father, but I couldn't go back to that. It was over. I had done what I wanted and had no intention of turning back. Time passed. Life went on as usual. My real estate income became stable. I invested some of the money in a new project, expanded further, and consolidated what I had built. I saw how my efforts were turning into a system that worked on its own, but deep down, I understood that the real goal wasn't about money, apartments, or tenants. The real goal was to prove to them that I could do it, that I was stronger, that I wasn't the useless child they thought I was. And that goal was achieved. But along with it, I received something I didn't expect: emptiness and the understanding that no victory would bring back what had never been: a normal family, respect, and support. I had achieved everything I wanted, but at the same time, I realized I had nothing more to say to them and nothing more to expect. The ending of this story was cold, but that was exactly how it had to be. I now had power, but my parents' recognition had lost all value, and that was my true victory.